tired. I'm tired.
Hare Krishna, you're listening to the Late Morning Program podcast with Namras. This is Namras, your host, and this is the #1 Hare Krishna podcast in the world. I'm so honored and grateful to have His Holiness B.V. Tripurari Maharaj joining me here today. Thank you, Maharaj, for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So Maharaj, I just want everyone to kind of understand your story and what you're about, your personality, and things like that. So let's start out by talking a little bit about how you joined Krishna Consciousness. I know you're a disciple of Srila Prabhupada, thrice initiated by him, and let's just talk a little bit about how you know, where you grew up and kind of how you got into contact with devotees.
Well, we could go back a long ways. I think the story begins in Vaikuntha for all of us, but perhaps a little bit differently than some people think about it. Just as a philosophical kind of jumping off point, it's mentioned in Chaitanya Charitamrita that Narayan in Vaikuntha is surrounded by muktas, liberated souls, and immersed in leelas with them and so forth. His life is complete is the implication. But at the same time, he has a desire to bestow mukti. And there's no one there to bestow mukti on.
Wow.
So there's a corresponding world, if you will, manifest by Mahasankarshan, the expansion of Balaram in Vaikuntha, who appears as Mahavishnu. And the one, Mahavishnu, becomes many. And the Narayan, in his various avatars, he crosses from up, avatara, crosses down himself, of course, in different ways, as Leela avatars, Yuga avatars, and so forth. And thus the compassionate side, if you will, of God is manifest in relation to persons like myself, all of us probably listening to this podcast, right? So just as the world has no beginning, the jivas have no beginning, the glue to keep them together, karma has no beginning, but bhakti in the world has no beginning either. So there's the current of karma, and there's a current of bhakti. And so Brahmanda Brahmite Kon Bhagyavanji, Guru Krishna Prasade Bhai Bhakti Lata. So the bhagya, I became lucky. And the luck, yadrichaya is another word that's used, for example, in relation to Sukadev, who appeared on the scene of Raj Parikshit's sitting on the bank of the Ganga and posing the important questions that he did. Yadrichaya means that it means like causeless, so without any reason, without cause and effect, without the influence of karma. Some people are moving in this world, as Gita says, Mahatmanastumam prata daivim prakritim ashrita. So daivim prakritim, under the influence of internal energy, the Swarup Shakti of Krishna. Some souls are moving and they're touching others, right?
Yes.
So they're not moving under the influence of karma. So this is how bhakti comes to all of us. And I'm not an exclusion there. And of course, in the particulars of that, I myself, as a young man, I think I first saw the devotees at the famous Woodstock Festival in upstate New York in 1969. Wow. And I joined a little while after that. I didn't have any conversations with them at the time, but I was interested in meditation, yoga, and I actually left the United States and I went to the Caribbean, to Jamaica, and I lived in the foothills of Jamaica. I was the only white person there. And I learned to terrace the hillside and grow roots and whatnot, and built a bamboo hut, and I was there to meditate my life away. But there were a lot of mosquitoes. It was a problem for me, and then the rainy season came, wiped out my hut. So I gave it up, and I came back to the United States, and I hitchhiked to California, where I had been living. And I guess prior to that, I had gotten a pack of incense that on the back of which it said, "Chant this mantra and your life will be sublime." So that was my mantra, Hare Krishna mantra. I used to chant it, and that was my mantra for meditating while I was in Jamaica. And as I came across the United States and hitchhiked, and when I arrived back in California in the Santa Cruz Mountains, I had, when I arrived, my friends were surprised to see me, and they knew what I was about, and they said, for the most part, they said there happens to be a festival in Berkeley this weekend. The Krishnas are putting on, so we should go. So, we got in a Volkswagen van, and we went to San Francisco. Actually, the festival was in Berkeley, Volunteer Park, and they had a big murti of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, huge, like 10, 12, 15 feet tall. And the festival consisted just of chanting, and there was some distribution of halava. And there were a lot of carnations that the devotees had brought to decorate the deity and so forth. And one of the carnations fell off onto the ground, and I picked it up. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's pose was like this: one hand lost in Mahabhav, the other hand reaching out for distribution, dissemination. And I thought innocently that if I throw the flower to offer to him and it lands in his hand, it will mean he accepts me. And he caught it. So I thought,
wow. Wonderful.
And the devotees were so absorbed in their own bliss that they didn't talk to me or try to convert me, or didn't have any strategy like that. So I just went back to the Santa Cruz Mountains, and I shaved my head, and I had acquired a Krishna book, and I used to give class from the Krishna book to my friends. I don't know what those classes were like in those days, but that was my natural tendency to express, the enthusiasm that I had gained. And then some devotees from Los Angeles came to Santa Cruz to open a preaching center, and they heard about me up in the hills. So they came up to find me. And the fellow that I was, one of my roommates was a gay man who was tall and had long black hair. Whenever the devotees would show up here and there, he would pull out his orange robe and put it on and go and dance around them. So when he saw me had shaved my head, he said, "You need this more than I do." So he gave me the orange robes. So when the devotees came, they saw me. There I was with shaved head and orange robe and so forth, and make them, "You're doing it all wrong. You can't do it like that." I was married at the time, so you couldn't go back to Godhead if you were wearing the wrong color cloth, I guess. So anyway, they told me that I had to follow them. I had no objection to that. So I wanted guidance and so forth. And so I moved in with them in their preaching center. And after a couple of months, Prabhupada came to Los Angeles. And so they took me there to be initiated by Prabhupada, myself and my wife. And my wife was pregnant. And I should say she was with me in Jamaica also. And so Prabhupada didn't want us to travel because she was too far along. So wanted us to stay in Los Angeles, which I did. And unfortunately, my wife did not remain in the mission. She was distracted by the world. So I became a monk, a renunciate. And shortly thereafter, after a few years, Prabhupada gave me sannyas. And
there are not many sannyasis left who were kind of given sannyas by Srila Prabhupada, right? There's you, yourself, and a few others.
Yeah, there's only a few. Prabhupada gave me sannyas in 1975 in Vrindavan at the time the Krishna Balaram temple opened.
Oh, right.
Which was a very big event for me, because I knew it was so very, very important to Prabhupada. And I had a party of devotees who were engaged in distributing books, and the money that we were raising from that was all going at that time to open the Krishna Balaram temple.
Right.
So when the temple opened, Prabhupada had our party and another party, which was a fundraising party organized by Guru Kripa and the Shodanandan Swamis. Those two parties contributed a greater balance of funds to build the Krishna Balaram temple. So Prabhupada carved on it, had it engraved on the marble in the temple there, the name of our party and Guru Kripa and the Shodanandan.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if
It's in the back of the temple room on the,
yeah.
on the left side. They're up on top. I've seen that before. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to toot my own horn or anything like that.
Right.
It was very important to me because I knew how important it was to Prabhupada at the time.
Yeah.
It wasn't entirely clear how important it was internally to Prabhupada to open a temple with Krishna and Balaram in the center and so forth. But it became more apparent in time. But at the opening, then it was a very powerful experience for me. And just a couple of days after the temple was opened, Prabhupada gave me sannyas.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about book distribution, because I know there's that famous letter where Prabhupada said to you, you are the incarnation of book distribution. So I don't know if many of our listeners know that, but there's a letter that where Prabhupada states that to Maharaj. And so I kind of want to understand a little bit about in present day, I know, the way book distribution is going and how it was in the past. How is your relationship with book distribution kind of evolved? Just to jump kind of to that a little bit.
Well, I took up the distribution of Prabhupada's books at a time when in Los Angeles there was a warehouse full of books and nobody knew what to do with them. Nobody really understood why so many of them were being printed.
Right.
And there were devotees trying to distribute them, and they were successful to some extent and so forth. But there were a lot more books, let's say, in the warehouse than there were anywhere else, and they were piling up.
Yeah.
I did not have any education past high school, and I had never had a job. So I had no real honed skills or talents, so to speak. But I had, as I mentioned earlier, just a penchant to express my insights and realizations and share them in the hope that they might grow. And so I used to go out by myself to Hollywood Boulevard and other places and sell the books. I didn't really understand at the time that it was important to Prabhupada, or that that it was something dear to him. But it did endear me to him, and I was successful. I used to go and to the morning program, and then I would, afterwards, after breakfast, I would go and stand in front of the deities and chant japa until I became very inspired. And then I would pack up some books and go out and distribute them.
Wow.
So that's how I began with the book distribution. And then, of course, Ramaswar was kind of an organizer, godbrother of mine and friend of mine. And so he kind of organized my raw talent, kind of so to speak, if you will, and tried to showcase it and inspire others. And he was successful in that. And so the book distribution became a very prominent feature of ISKCON, and I was very central to that. So Prabhupada, said something generous. His generosity about me is the way I look at that. But unfortunately or fortunately, the fact of the matter is that it evolved into kind of a, I think overall fortunately, but into kind of a spiritual terrorism we were involved in at the time. Prabhupada felt that any publicity was good publicity. So just like a terrorist state, let's take Palestine, for example, Yasser Arafat began a terrorist campaign to get attention from the public to the plight of the Palestinians. So he would perform some horrific, terrorist act, get attention, and then there was a chance to say a few words about the plight of Palestine, and he was successful.
Right.
But eventually, from becoming a terrorist, he became representative in the UN for Palestine. So, we went out and somehow or other we sold the books. And Prabhupada even told us, by hook or by crook, to sell the book. There probably were better ways to do it. But somehow or other we were successful, and it's not that we didn't irritate some people at the time, that we were doing it as well. But Prabhupada always has encouraged us to continue. But I think, to follow through on your question, the continuation should be ongoing, and times have changed. So all publicity is no longer good publicity.
Right.
And so so I think that also the times have changed in ways that, for example, in the 60s and the 70s, it was more common for people to be on the streets to communicate ideas. There was no internet.
Right.
And so I would think that being on the street in the way that we were on the street when I was young would not be probably as would be a little more odd, perhaps, in the eye of the public. I'm not sure, because I don't do that. I don't go out on the street and sell the books. I've kind of evolved into writing books.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to touch on that
It's important.
a little later on the writing part. Regarding, and now I want to kind of jump back to your journey in ISKCON and kind of a little bit later on. So for our listeners, what happened was that devotees, Srila Prabhupada's disciples, were introduced to Srila Prabhupada's godbrother, Srila Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Maharaj.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could, Maharaj, talk a little bit about him and his relationship with Prabhupada as kind of an introduction.
Yes, well, Prabhupada was very close with Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj. I would say that he's the godbrother that Prabhupada was was closest with. And during the time that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was present and leading his mission, Prabhupada and Sridhar Maharaj spent time together and served. Although Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj was a sannyasin and Prabhupada was a householder at that time. But after the passing of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, then his disciples and his mission went through a period of trying to figure themselves out in terms of how to proceed in the absence of their great leader, general, and so forth. And the history of all of that is really impossible for us to sort out with any, degree of accuracy. We hear something here, something there, and so forth. But overall, different devotees, I would say, disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, tried their best to proceed with what knowledge they had and so on. And during that early period, Prabhupada was living in Calcutta, and he had, I think, 2 flats, and he gave one to Sridhar Maharaj, who and hosted him there, for 6 years.
Wow.
While Prabhupada wrote his Gita commentary, Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj was writing his Gita commentary as well. Prabhupada looked at Sridhar Maharaj as somewhat of a mentor. He referred to him, really the first thing we heard about him was in a letter that he wrote to Achyutananda Maharaj, Prabhupada's disciple, who was in India and felt that since Prabhupada was in America for some time, that he felt in the need of guidance and association. And Sridhar Maharaj, Prabhupada wrote to him and said, "You can take shelter and guidance from my godbrother Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Dev of Navadvip. Would speak of what you can learn from him. I consider him my Siksha Guru." So
Wow.
Prabhupada had a relationship with him, and where Sridhar Maharaj had been a member of the Math, took the sannyas from Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He was a teacher, within the mission, and so forth. Often after Saraswati Thakur gave classes, Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj would be approached by other disciples to ask what was he saying, and to further explain, elucidate on his lecture and so forth. So Prabhupada once told Hamsaduta, his disciple, that everything I learned from Sridhar Maharaj. What he meant by that was that he didn't have a lot of direct association with Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and he told us that. He had a couple of instructions that he took really very seriously, even suggestions that he write in English. He took it like an order from Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. But as far as like living with Sridhar Maharaj and discussing philosophy, well, Sridhar Maharaj was somewhat of a mentor to Prabhupada, such that he referred to him as a Siksha Guru. And so he was a known, figure in ISKCON, in that sense that Prabhupada had mentioned him. Chutananda Maharaj had gone then and spent, 3, 4, 6 months living there. But Prabhupada's campaign was so exciting, and he was so prominent that on the one hand, and on the other hand, some of the godbrothers of Prabhupada were not inclined to assist him, and even some were antagonistic, and probably, based on misinformation, misunderstanding. I don't want to judge their motives. How can I? But at any rate, they weren't. Some of them were antagonistic, it would appear, and
Right.
but Sridhar Maharaj was not. And for example, Prabhupada struggled to get land in Mayapur, and Sridhar Maharaj was the one who assisted him in that at the time, while others were probably concerned that Western people were going to come and pollute the Dham or something like that, perhaps. So on the one hand, Prabhupada was very prominent in our lives. There was no second person really. And on the other hand, some of Prabhupada's godbrothers were antagonistic. And at a certain point, Prabhupada started to say things like, well, we shouldn't associate with them. Earlier on, when I was in Los Angeles, Prabhupada shipped a bunch of books published by the Gaudiya Math to Los Angeles, and I used to sell them at the book table on Sunday Sunday program. Prabhupada didn't have, I don't think he had Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, maybe the Nectar of Devotion, a couple of smaller books, something like that. So we had all these little books, and from Gaudiya Math, and translations in English. I call it Benglish, kind of half English, half Bengali, of Bhakti Vinod's work and so forth.
Right.
So Prabhupada sent them for us to distribute. Later, when he didn't get the kind of reception from some of his godbrothers that he had expected, when he announced the mission is going on here, it's successful, let's join together and so forth. I mean, they were entrenched for years and years in their own preaching efforts and so forth. I don't think they understood what was happening with Prabhupada very well.
Right.
But at any rate, many of them, some of them weren't helpful. And so at a certain point, he cautioned us. And so we didn't have any reason. Prabhupada was prominent. Some godbrothers were not favorable. So we didn't have any reason to further pursue a statement of Prabhupada that Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj was even his Siksha Guru. And it didn't register with us.
Right.
It probably registered more with the Chutananda Maharaj, who spent the time there and so forth. But that's how Sridhar Maharaj was introduced to the society. And some of the devotees, leading devotees in ISKCON who served in Mayapur, knew Sridhar Maharaj, had occasion to go to him for certain things and so forth. So there was always a friendly relationship. I think there was an article in Back to Godhead, published The Descent of the Holy Name, that was a recorded transcription of Sridhar Maharaj answering questions from one of the editors in Back to Godhead. Prabhupada also published in Back to Godhead some articles of Dr. Kapoor, Keshava Das, another one of his godbrothers. But again, the mission was very powerful and very exciting, and they were interesting figures, and they were very good articles. They were very well received articles, but they weren't persons to, that we felt compelled or any reason to go to necessarily. But with the passing of Prabhupada, things changed considerably. And just prior to his passing, I was with him in Vrindavan, and my godbrother Tamal Krishna Maharaj asked him that if he should pass away, how will we, perform the funeral rites? We don't know about that. And he said, for that you can ask Narayan Maharaj in Mathura. And I was massaging Prabhupada's feet at the time, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj asked a question that I wouldn't have asked. It wouldn't have come to my mind. But he said, in your absence, is there anybody else we can consult with? And he said, for philosophy, my godbrother B.R. Sridhar Maharaj is Navadvip. So to me at the time, it didn't, I heard it, I remember it well, of course, and others do it also. But it still wasn't didn't drive me to go and seek him out, because I had Prabhupada was still there. For one thing, we never thought he was going to leave, and even after he left, I didn't go to Sridhar Maharaj because there were other leaders of the mission that Prabhupada seemed to defer to, and certainly wanted them to step into the shoes of fulfilling the role of his in terms of initiating disciples and so forth, and I tried to work with them and support them and so forth. Unfortunately, many of them had trouble walking in those shoes,
right?
And that was you couldn't probably find a worse crisis when the spiritual leadership becomes questionable and very very questionable. Things were happening at the time that were very, very, very disconcerting for us. And I did go to Sridhar Maharaj ultimately. I kind of looked at, I suppose, by some many as a maverick and independent, didn't want to follow authority and so forth. But it's really quite the opposite. I was really craving for actual spiritual authority, and those whom I had put faith in and supported more often than not at that time turned out not to be. And so the prospect of hearing from Sridhar Maharaj was something that was growing, because now the times had changed considerably. And it's written in the books that there's a Siksha Guru and a Diksha Guru. It didn't really mean much to us. Prabhupada was a Siksha Guru, Diksha Guru, Bharata Production Guru, any way you look at it, so to speak. But it is a prominent aspect of the teaching. And Sridhar Maharaj came to fulfill that role for Prabhupada's disciples who, of their own volition, without him canvassing them in any way, which was farthest thing from his mind, of their own volition, came to him looking for guidance where it was lacking in ISKCON. And the guidance he gave was you couldn't have found a more perfect Siksha Guru in one sense, because he knew Prabhupada well. They lived together. They were friends. He had assisted Prabhupada in some ways. Prabhupada had invited him to oversee the installation of the Ananta Sesh deity in the building of the Mayapur temple. And he came for that occasion. There's pictures of that, and I think some video of that. The Prabhupada sat him on the same Vyasasana and so forth. and so on. And they lived together. And when he came that time to visit Prabhupada in Mayapur to oversee the installation of the Anantasteshri, Prabhupada greeted him in his gumsha. Sridhar Maharaj used to refer to the back of that, how intimate, they were,
Right.
So to speak. And so, he knew Prabhupada and he loved what Prabhupada was doing. Prabhupada was outgoing. Sridhar Maharaj was a very introverted person. He didn't like to be in big circles, and Bhaktisiddhanta actually chose him to go to London first. But Sridhar Maharaj said that he didn't think he was the best candidate. So he said, whatever you want, Guru Maharaj, I will do, but there are others amongst us who speak better English. I'm very introverted type of person. Others are more outgoing. And also, I think that I could benefit personally from your association, and I don't know how much longer you'll be with us. So Bhaktisiddhanta said, oh, you stay here then. And he selected, I think, Bon Maharaj or Goswami Maharaj to go, both of them, different times. He said, Bhaktisiddhanta, I chose Sridhar Maharaj to go because I knew he could never be converted. So the two, Prabhupada and Sridhar Maharaj, they were very different. And it was very interesting to have the association of a person. Like, I had the experience that Prabhupada could turn my head with the things he said and he wrote about and so forth, like no one else could. I had the same experience with Sridhar Maharaj. So I knew I was taking fruit from the same tree.
Wow.
Even though they were very different, they were different in their personalities. They were different in their focuses. They interpreted some verses differently, both fell within the parameters of the Siddhanta, but so it was a very powerful and compelling kind of experience to be in his association and to be able to. He told us that Prabhupada, Swami Maharaj, he put so many things in your heart, and now you have to reflect on those and bring those out, and I will try to help you. So he saw himself in an assisting role, but he was a very competent teacher. His Bhaktisiddhanta referred to him as Shastra Nipun, which is in scriptural genius. It's a word that Rupa Goswami uses to characterize the Uttamadhikari. So competent in terms of his acquaintance with Gaudiya Vaishnavism, competent in terms of knowing who Prabhupada was and what Prabhupada expected of us and so forth. And competent also not only in terms of knowing the Siddhanta, but deep experience. Many devotees asked him for initiation after the departure of Bhaktisiddhanta, but he was unwilling to do so. He went to Ekchakra and he asked in prayer Nityananda Prabhu, who appeared there, for his permission to retire and reside in the Dham. And the impression he got in his heart from Nityananda Prabhu was, you asked me for your mercy, but you're not willing to give your mercy to anyone. So he bargained with Nityananda Prabhu and said, okay, I got your permission to live in the Dham, and if anybody comes, I won't turn them away, but I'm not going to run here and there and everywhere trying to collect people. That's not my nature. And so he resided in the Dham, and he had a small mission there.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense in this when you say, okay, with the disappearance of Srila Prabhupada, you kind of had to look at two sides. It was one side of ISKCON and all the issues that were happening with kind of a very immature leadership, and then you had someone like Sridhar Maharaj who had been sannyas probably like 50 years at that point, or just like a very experienced kind of person who was very similar to Srila Prabhupada. So what was it I understand there were some issues with devotees going to him later on, right? After there was, because he was attracting so many of Prabhupada's disciples, the leadership of ISKCON had some issues with that.
Well, the leadership of ISKCON was lacking in love and ruled by rules. I think the more there is love, the less there are rules. The more there are rules, the less there is love. If you live in the same room with somebody, and after a while, you find he likes to stay up late, you like to get up early, you might make some rules and put them on the wall and say, we can stay together here, but you agree to this and I agree to that.
Right.
Whereas if there's love, well, the fact that he stays up late makes you want to stay up late. The fact that you get up early makes him want to get up early, or her. Yeah. So it's a sharing of hearts, an exchange of hearts, love, right? Yeah. There's no rules in love. Prabhupada wanted his mission to be ruled by love and trust. He used to allow the GBC to meet for only 3 days to discuss how to preach and so forth. But after Prabhupada left, it became so many rules, and there were the affection of Prabhupada I couldn't feel in the same way. And so at a certain point, yes, the GBC went to Sridhar Maharaj, asked him advice, he gave advice, they published a paper based on his advice, and but he was not there just to give ditto to whatever they approve whatever they said. He had his own mind, his own opinion, and so on and so forth. So sometimes he'd say, I don't think that's what Swami Maharaj would have wanted, or I don't think that's the philosophy, and so forth. So the leaders, the gurus in particular, were struggling to be as I say, to fit into those shoes. Yeah. And they were losing the ground in terms of the faith, their ability to collect the faith particularly of their godbrothers. And it wasn't a pleasant time for many of us. I was in one zone, and I had a picture of Prabhupada on my desk. The guru at the time came in and said, why do you have a picture of Prabhupada on your desk? I'm the guru here. So well, that was a little hard to digest. And I didn't mind having his picture.
Oh, and he was your godbrother.
Yeah. So, I don't really blame them. They had a difficult role to fulfill and so forth.
Right.
But to me, when I began to hear from Sridhar Maharaj, I thought, here's a solution. But I was surprised that they didn't feel the same way. In fact, they made a resolution that anyone who wants to take Siksha outside of ISKCON, which was just referring to Sridhar Maharaj, had to leave ISKCON. So I was faced with, okay, Prabhupada wanted us to follow the GBC. I'm not dumb, There's a purpose for following them, to become Krishna conscious. It's not something you follow them blindly. And with regard to what? With regard to, well, they're a management body.
Yes.
So it's supposed to manage in such a way that they're not needed anymore. So that those who are managed are spontaneously inspired to do what's necessary. Like for me, for example, we were talking earlier about book distribution. So I was just going and distributing books. And at a certain point, I was asked to go to Australia. And from there, I was invited to Mayapur, the first festival. Prabhupada invited me, just to go back a few years here. And while I was in Australia teaching there, the GBC in charge of Los Angeles, who I grew up under for a couple of years, he left the mission. So that was a surprise to me, but it was something that I thought, oh, it happens. And so when I went to Mayapur that year, Prabhupada talked to me and he said, all year long, you should work under me, you should go and distribute books, and then come spend 2 months with me in Mayapur, a month with me in Mayapur and Vrindavan. So I was kind of like, okay, that's what I did. And I started my own party and so forth. I didn't have a GBC. I didn't think about it like that. I was just doing what I was inspired to do, and Prabhupada was pleased with it. And so the next year, that's 1975, I think, because I think the first festival was 1974. The GBC called me into their meeting, and there I went, and they said, what they wanted, they asked me was, who is your GBC? You're traveling around, you're raising money, I was sending it all to the book fund at that time,
Yeah.
every penny, and living out of a bag that when the books were emptied, I put more books in, and send the money and fill it up with books. So they asked, who's your GBC? Under whose control are you functioning? And I said, well, I knew what they wanted. They were competing with one of who would control me, who would have me in their zone, so they could say where my money, the money that I collected, went. I mean, I wasn't dumb. So I said, I don't have it. Well, I said, well, my GBC was Karundar, but he blooped. So they all blushed, at the point. I mean, they knew that, but they said, well, anyway, you have to have a GBC. I said, well, select one then. I don't mind, whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
So then they would go to Prabhupada as they would, and they would say, this is a G resolution. He would say yay or nay. They would go through them. So when they came to me, they said, and Tripurari Das, and Prabhupada said, what has he done? His eyes got wide. And I know this because 3 of the GBC came and told me this. And Prabhupada said, what has he done? And then before they could answer, he said, he is distributing my books. And they said, well, he doesn't have a GBC. And Prabhupada said, he doesn't need a GBC. He's doing without need of any management what we want him to do. Not that everybody's supposed to distribute books, but to spontaneously serve and so forth. So, Tripurari Das didn't need a GBC. And then, interestingly enough, they passed a resolution, which was a wise enough resolution that same year, 1975, no one could take sannyas without the recommendation of the GBC and being on 1 year of waiting, because some sannyasis who were not proved themselves not capable of living up to their vows, and that was an embarrassment to Prabhupada, so to speak.
Right.
So that was in Mayapur. Then the festival moved to Vrindavan, and Vrindavan Prabhupada gave me sannyas. That was 2 weeks later.
Wow.
So he didn't, so much for that GBC resolution. It was a good resolution, but it didn't pertain in all circumstances. Rules are, meant to be broken. If we really understand them, we know when to break them. So,
can you elaborate on that a little bit? Meant to be broken. What do you mean by that?
It's just like if you come out of animality to humanity, you're expected to follow certain rules that aren't expected of animals.
Right.
But the rules in the moral life, if you will, is something like living in a cage. You're not supposed to stay in a cage. Don't do this, don't do that. There's a reason for it. Don't do this, don't do that. You should do it like this. But if you understand the import of them, then you can come out of the cage and you can be free.
Right.
So the moral life is not the sum and substance of spiritual life by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, Krishna Leelas teaches this by example. Krishna doesn't appear. What I mean to say, Krishna doesn't appear to be moral. He's super moral, obviously.
Right.
He's foregoing the Dharma. Sarva Dharman Prityaja Mahamekam Saranam Brother. So he's crossing over the moral. So rules have a purpose, and if you understand the purpose and you've risen to that occasion, then you may follow them to set an example for others who need that. But you're not bound by them. It's not a license to be immoral or anything of the sort. But this is very central, obviously, to the teaching. So again, where there's love, there are really no rules. Where love is lacking, to that extent, there are going to be rules. So one of the rules that the GBC came up with, probably one of the worst ones in history, was anyone who wants to take Siksha outside of ISKCON has to leave ISKCON. It pertained only to Sridhar Maharaj because people were taking Siksha outside of ISKCON.
Yeah.
Well, at that time, it wasn't really outside of ISKCON. So they, made a dividing line. And I think that they were intimidated by just the person of Sridhar Maharaj, his spirituality, and his ability to capture the faith of others by his discourse and by his example that exceeded their own. At the same time, that's obviously doesn't sound like a bad thing at all. Why would they be afraid of it? I think they were confused, that they were supposed to be the leaders. He was going to become a leader. without trying.
Yeah.
Then maybe he would try to take over Prabhupada's position, and we have to keep Prabhupada's position in the center. You know, they had these kind of fears. Some of it based on, as I said earlier, things that Prabhupada had said about God brothers who were antagonistic and so forth. And so they made this resolution. So what could you do? I mean, the resolution really was really fueled by, unfortunately, by Vaishnava Prabhupada, because Sridhar Maharaj was doing what Prabhupada suggested that he do for us, as I mentioned. Yeah. And, you know, we were coming to him. Even the GBC went to him, brought him out. He just answered the questions, and you know, they'd ask him a question, and he'd give an answer that was like you'd make it forget the question and just, you know, soar into the heights of or the depths of his spiritual preoccupation. Wow. You know, so he did away with questions, although he answered them. He did away with doubts and so forth. So you know, they wanted to control the mission. They had good intentions and so forth. But anyway, they made a resolution. So here, a person like me is faced with, well, either I follow the GBC, because Prabhupada wants to follow the GBC, or I offend Sridhar Maharaj. So, you know, it's an obvious choice if you know the philosophy. GBC is, you know, this is a relative figure. This is a managerial, you know, figure. Yeah. You know, it's not a. So I follow the GBC. Anyway, I went outside of ISKCON to take shelter of Sridhar Maharaj. So I followed the GBC, and I didn't offend Sridhar Maharaj, because unfortunately, along with the resolution at the time in ISKCON, came a consistent and very amplified broadcast of offensive rhetoric, implied and directly concerning Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj. And, you know, that's just a historical fact. And I didn't want to be part of that. So, again, I had a choice: follow the GBC or and offend Sridhar Maharaj, or not follow GBC. But I followed the GBC and went outside of ISKCON and took shelter of Sridhar Maharaj, who asked me to start a mission, suggested when I asked for service, he said, Prabhupada has told you everything. Go and start a mission. He would expect that of you, and I'll be in the background, and I can help and come to me as needed and so forth.
How many devotees approximately was it that made that choice to move over and, I mean, follow as you said, follow the GBC and go there?
It was like the Kurukshetra war, the Pandavas and the Kurus. we were small in number. And, you know, I think that the leaders of ISKCON were not that well informed about the philosophy. I mean, I wasn't, compared to how I am now.
Right.
And so the wise thing to do would have been to say, all right, some of the devotees, some of the disciples of Prabhupada have developed an affinity for Sridhar Maharaj, who is someone that Prabhupada has introduced to us, and who's someone who Prabhupada said we could take, go to for philosophy, as I mentioned. Prabhupada has said that. So some want to do that. We as the GBC think that can be problematic for the management of the society, because they'll be getting siksha from a spiritual authority who's not under the control of the management. Right. And so it could be problematic. That was their theory. And so what they should have said was, all right, let them go then, let them serve separately outside of ISKCON, and we'll continue in this way, and let's keep tabs with one another and see how it goes.
Oh, wow.
And there may be some occasions we can come together, for events. And here's a new chapter. Some of Prabhupada's disciples are now also influenced by one of his godbrothers, who was his own Siksha guru and dear friend. So it's a side of Prabhupada. Some of my godbrothers think, well, he left Prabhupada.
Yeah.
But I entered into a chapter in Prabhupada's life, an aspect of Prabhupada's life that they're not privy to. But I haven't lost anything that they already know about Prabhupada. If you want to compare notes, I know really much about Prabhupada. And Prabhupada knew me personally. Prabhupada talked to me personally, wrote letters to me personally, and so forth.
Right.
So, and also if you take the very, fundamental equation of beta bed, chinta beta bed, so you have, there's a oneness in the philosophy. The philosophy is one. Within the parameters of that singular philosophy, there's room for different expressions of the philosophy. There's Sakya Bhava, there's Madhurya Bhava, for example.
Right.
There's ways in which you could serve, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Smaranam, and so forth, that are differences. And so similarly, having a Siksha guru, someone would say, well, what do you need a Siksha guru for? I mean, there wasn't a time, I think, historically for Prabhupada's disciples where there wouldn't be more of a need for a Siksha guru. ISKCON was really struggling at that time with how to proceed and so forth. There's, we used to be called prostitutes, and our chastity was questioned. But there's a difference between chastity and purity. They don't always go together. If you're pure, you're chaste, but you could be chaste but not pure.
Right.
And so, but if you're pure, you have to have been chaste, because how could you be pure? You follow? In other words, if you're chaste to your guru's teachings and to go to your Vaishnavism, that's the only way to become pure. So if you're pure, but it looks on the surface that you're not chaste because now you're not following, you're not in ISKCON, in Prabhupada's formal mission, you're over here with this other person, Sridhar Maharaj. Chastity is questioned. This is a superficial understanding. But if you see that there's purity and there's understanding of Krishna consciousness and it's growing and so forth, then you have to rethink what in a more dynamic sense, what chastity constitutes. Chastity in a formal and a physical sense is one thing. Let's say a child, the son of a business man, in his childhood walks in his father's shoes and stumbles, and everybody thinks it's very cute. And so they say, oh, he's going to be a follower of his father, True. But I mean, really to be a follower of his father, he has to take the business, to be a son and a follower of his father. He has to take the business, understand the business, and take it to a new level. Let's say you were, let's say Jeff Bezos had a bookstore.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I don't think he did, but let's say he did, for example. So his son, this was going to follow in his footsteps and sell books. And he had the idea, let's sell them online.
Right.
Wait a minute, and next thing he's selling other things too. So has he deviated here, or has he, he changed the thing in form and appearance in so many ways, but it's the same thing. So to keep up with the current that takes some, spirituality.
Wow.
And to separate out externals from, the substance from form, details from principles. What's a detail and what's a principle? Like sometimes in ISKCON, they say, well, if you want to understand the teaching, Prabhupada's books will come first, and then later on the previous acharyas, but whatever he says is prominent. That only holds true for details. Prabhupada's not the person who's going to give you the Siddhanta anew. It's already been established. The founding acharyas of the Sampradaya carved out the Siddhanta
Right.
in their core texts. And Prabhupada taught us his credibility lied in repeating what they said, although he may apply that with different details according to time and circumstance, which is, the core of how to preach. So those details will become prominent over the details that may have been found in earlier texts, but the teaching itself, the Siddhanta, that's not something that Prabhupada just can make up and differ from, not that he didn't do that, I'm saying, but
Yeah.
And so, if you want to teach like that, the Prabhupada's book should be most prominent because he's the current acharya. Then you would have to teach that the current acharya is
I think we lost you there, Maharaj, for a little while. Looks like we're having a little bit of audio issues. We'll just give him, Maharaj, a minute to come back. On my side, it's frozen. I don't know if anyone else is having that.
Prabhupada, which you should.
Well, 1 second, Maharaj. A little frozen here. Oh. Okay. Well, Maharaj dropped off. He'll be joining again. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We have like 180 people watching. This is great. Wonderful. I mean, I love hearing Maharaj's side of the story, for sure. I think it's something that we don't necessarily hear about. Yes, he does have someone helping him. They will rejoin. Let me see. Let me give us a chance. It'll give us a chance to digest everything Maharaj was saying. Let's see here. Okay, I think we got Maharaj back here. Device is not connected. Oh, Krishna. I think he's rejoining, but a little bit of issues with the devices, it seems. Let's give him a minute here. Okay. Yeah, there's so many questions coming in. We have to. It's a really hard balancing hearing from Maharaj, but also interrupting his thought process and so allowing him to develop what he's articulating. Okay, looks like he's rejoining. It seems like there is some. Okay.
Hello?
Hare Krishna?
Hello?
Yes, Maharaj.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I cannot see you yet.
Unfortunately, I'm having a hard time hearing you. I don't know what the problem is. Maybe, can you hear me?
I can hear you. It's a little lag. There's a lag though.
Okay. Can you see me?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, I can keep talking, I guess.
Yeah, you could, I guess. I don't know if the devotee who's working with you there is are you near are you using Wi-Fi, or is it wired in? Everyone, please stay tuned. This is a part of doing an online show. There's always the technical part of it. Maharaj, can you hear me? If you go to the bottom,
Did he stop or?
maybe that's a phone call.
Hello?
Yes, Maharaj?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know what happened, but
If you go to, if the devotee helping you goes to the bottom of the screen, there's a button that says cam/mic. If you click that, you might be able to tweak the videos to get the input of what you were using earlier.
Tell them we are going to restart Maharaj's computer.
Okay, you're going to restart Maharaj's computer. That's fine. Okay, great. Solar listeners, Maharaj's computer will be restarted. And then we'll add him back to the stream. Yes, Guru Nishta Prabhu, thank you. I just got a message. It'll be restarting Maharaj. I forgot I'm able to post comments and things. But yeah, so we'll restart Maharaj's computer, and then he will rejoin. Okay. What a time to join. Yes. Having audio issues. Oh, okay. Anyways, the interview is going really beautifully. I mean, a lot of things, I think, audio is fine. Just put his photo distributing books if all else fails. So no, Daiva Prabhu, Hare Krishna, thank you for joining us. Oh, okay. Shamala, let's see this. Namras, what inspired to share his story? I mean, he's an ISKCON hero. I mean, it's like I'm an ISKCON history buff. I love everything about how things developed, and he's just such a part of it. He's just a part of that history from the very beginning, and being the incarnation of book distribution, getting sannyas from Srila Prabhupada, and then developing into what happened with Sridhar Maharaj. And I think that's a very fascinating history. And to hear that is very valuable, because we don't get to hear these kind of things. It's kind of, okay, what we might hear, what we might read on the internet, or what someone might tell us that they heard. But hearing it directly from someone who was there, I think we don't necessarily get that a lot. So it's just a really valuable thing to hear. Yeah, my friend Jay Jagannath. How are you hearing Maharaj's story? I mean, this is something I know, and I mean, I knew a lot of this stuff from hearing Maharaj previously, also reading things, but there are things that I haven't heard, and I'm just hearing them with a lot of gratefulness that this can be shared. Yeah, that this can be shared, widely, that this is what the history was. Because we don't want to, I was talking to Jonavi about this like yesterday. We don't want to hear kind of the towing the party line type things. Our younger generation, we just want to hear things as they are. Like, what was the history? What was the history? This is the history. It's coming straight from him. And that's his perspective. That's his experience. And we can't fault anyone for their experience. So I think that's why it's a really valuable thing to listen to. Bring Vaisheshika, Rameshwar, Pragosh, and Tripurari Maharaj together. I mean, that would be like the book distribution all-star team. It would be very interesting, interview for sure. Did I get critiqued for that? No, maybe a little bit. I got a few messages saying maybe that's not a good idea to have Maharaj on. But this is, I just think like this is my show. I mean, I'm an ISKCON member. I'm a lifelong ISKCON member. I don't have any, I can't really go. I don't go anywhere else because that's been my life and that's my life. But I'm not going to limit myself to who I hear from in the sense of hearing, like coming on the show and talking about their experience, because I think it's a very valuable thing to hear from other devotees who are not in ISKCON. Okay, looks like Maharaj is rejoining. Let's everyone pray that this works. In the meantime, please follow my page and please like it and share it and tell your friends about it. This is the #1 Hare Krishna podcast in the world. I don't even know if it is. I just say that. Come on, Guru Nishta Prabhu. I hope you're on the phone there. Worst where it comes to worst, we will have part 2. Is it possible for Mars to call on his phone directly if the internet is still acting up? Do not. Oh yeah, I think actually he can. Yes, there is a way to do it via phone. I'm going to try to see if it will be possible. Give me a second. Everyone take a bathroom break, lunch break. Okay, let's see. I think I could do it via phone. Bluetooth. Okay, here we go. Pair device. Pair device. Okay, I've paired my device Guru Nishta Prabhu, can you get on Messenger? Maharaj can call me on my phone, and we can do this via phone. Guru Nishta Prabhu, I sent you a messenger message with the phone number Maharaj can call me at. This is a first for the late morning program. Hare Krishna? Hare Krishna Maharaj? Hare Krishna. 1 second. I don't hear you. Okay, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes. Hello?
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Oh, great. Okay, we have Maharaj back. Can our listeners, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay.
I don't know if you're able.
Let's let the we can hear Maharaj. Okay, good. All right, let's continue, Maharaj.
Okay.
Okay, so
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. No problem at all. So, we were talking about, you were making the point of, I can't exactly remember now that all this. So I guess where we can go now is,
Well, we were talking about there were difficult. It was how I left ISKCON and how it was maybe misunderstood by
right.
many godbrothers, and in retrospect, I think it's proven to be what I did. Persons like myself is perfectly within the parameters of the philosophy. Some of the ISKCON leaders didn't really understand the principle of the Siksha Guru,
Right.
how it would apply, because circumstance hadn't arisen where we would need one outside of Prabhupada, who was our Diksha and Siksha Guru. And so they thought it to be some kind of departure from the philosophy, but it's actually within the parameters of the philosophy. It's a difference, if you will, that it kind of it ornaments the philosophy. It's kind of the Bade, the difference of expression within the Bade, the singular philosophy. But in retrospect, over time now, it should be clear that I didn't end up in hell for rejecting my guru, which would have certain symptoms if I had, I would imagine.
I have a question. What are your thoughts on the younger generation, our generation, kind of inheriting certain feuds or partisan dealings within Gaudiya Vaishnavism? Like, is there a need for, somehow, when Prabhupada said, keep your distance from certain Vaishnavas and things like that? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that one thing is that you're kind of speaking from the ISKCON framework,
right?
You're for ISKCON, but
yeah,
ISKCON has its rules, and it tends to be, I would say, rather insular. But there are many members within it that don't identify with that insularity, and it's difficult for them to do so, for that matter, because on the ground the reality is very different. They may have a son who's initiated by somebody outside of ISKCON. they may have a grandson or a daughter or a wife or a husband, and in their everyday life, that those kind of insular mandates, if you will, that are well intended, but they have they're counterproductive. They don't really apply. So I think people have to put together, the reality on the ground, if you will, and see the extent to which it conflicts with a very sectarian and insular policy, and rise above it. That said, of course, yeah, I mean, who to associate with and who not. That's always going to be a question. There are going to be misrepresentations of the teachings. But I mean, you found that within ISKCON too. So what are you left with here? Somebody to tell you what to do at every minute, or to think for yourself, hopefully with spiritual insight. And you might make a mistake, but mistakes are only as bad as you don't learn from them. So, like for myself, often questions, I answer questions with questions. I try to encourage devotees to think, to use their intelligence and be, to use a phrase coined by Prabhupada. What was the phrase now? Independently thoughtful. And you can err in that and think outside of the parameters of the philosophy, but then there should be guidance available. We should all have persons in our lives, Vaishnavas in our lives, who we regard, who we think we feel confident that we can get the Siddhanta from. So there's no like silver bullet, if you will, or perfect formula, who to avoid, who not to. But I think that we would be wrong, or we would be perhaps endanger ourselves more by embracing a philosophy that cautions to the extreme against association with devotees outside of our group. We should rather than, because the scriptures they just amplify a very different message, right? They amplify the fact that the respect for devotees, seek association. If a sadhu comes to town and he's going to give a talk, I mean, I would invite him to my place. Right. I mean, if he says something wrong, well, okay, I mean, look at Prabhupada's own example in his own life. He told us that right. His father would invite anybody to the house that looked like a sadhu, even if they weren't, So he's erring on that side to some extent, perhaps. But what's the other side? You risk the potential of offending a Vaishnava to imbibing of some scar for Vaishnava aparad. I mean, that's very, very detrimental.
Yeah.
So I would encourage the devotees to kind of move in the opposite direction of that, and I've given lectures at times that were, inspiring, even to myself, and had persons in the audience who were godbrothers of mine, god sisters, and kind of officially members of ISKCON, but testing me out, so to speak, because I came there, and they said things like, "Well, that was really inspiring, but."
Right.
There's no place for that but you're not supposed to be as inspiring as this, because we were told, that you're like this, and that, we came here, we know you, so we respect you. But so I think, in the least, there's been so much of an emphasis on ISKCON of protecting the devotees from other devotees, that it's reached a point where it's. I mean, I'm not a member, so I haven't been for many, many years. You know, for 35 years. So I don't mean to try to characterize society in a way that it's inaccurate, but I just think overall my experience is that it's overemphasized and it's counterproductive, and it would be better to err on the other side. And for myself, I seek anybody who talks about Krishna. I'm interested. I read this. Somebody wrote something. I read. You know, if it doesn't, I'm well enough grounded in the philosophy. Well, this isn't, you know, actually what Chaitanya Mahaprabhu taught. Okay, he thinks like that. She thinks like that. But I'm not committing Vaishnava aparadh, you know.
Right.
So those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I find it really tricky when the new generation, or my generation rather, has to continue any type of like inheriting certain biases from the previous generation that they have, because it just makes things, it's like a breeding ground for offenses, even though like nothing happened to me personally or to another person, but we're told to, okay, we have to protect ISKCON, and for that reason we don't associate with certain people and things like that. So I understand both sides, to be honest, but I do think that there needs to be less of that, because it's just not, I don't understand why we have to be.
It's the biggest organization in the world of Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Right.
And it's all over the world and so forth. I don't really think it's in danger, you know.
Right.
And what I think is that ISKCON should be the society that acknowledges Krishna consciousness wherever it is.
Yeah.
And say, this is Krishna consciousness over here. It's a different mission. They have different details that they follow. Their morning program goes like this. Our morning program goes like this. Govinda, Madi, Purusha. They do it different, but there's room for these differences. That's fine. That's beautiful. And by acknowledging Krishna consciousness wherever it is, who would not want to be in that movement? Who would not want to be in that mission that is everywhere, and wherever there's Krishna consciousness, they acknowledge it, honor it. They don't try to manage it. They don't think that it has to be under their rule in terms of management in order for it to flourish. It's already flourishing. There it is.
Yeah.
And we point it out. We acknowledge, and we make a bond with them to whatever extent that we can to associate with on different occasions. And if somebody wants to go from our group to that group, or from that group to this group, it's a free market. You know, I mean, that's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It should be the free flow of faith. You know, it's not about collecting people, and it's about helping people to go back to Godhead. You know, so like I have disciples. If I find that somebody is inspiring to them, or there's an inspiring Vaishnava in the community that comes there, I generally want them to associate with them. There may be some persons who I don't, and I have the reasons, and I explain, but they're philosophical reasons, or they're reasons about the person's character or something like that. And that's very seldom, very rare. So, yeah.
Right.
And the same thing, books. Look at the BBT, you know, because I was always involved with books, and I'm an author now and so forth.
Yeah.
And, you know, what did Prabhupada want for his Back to God for his BBT? He formed ISKCON and he formed BBT. I look at it like a Chinta Beta Beta. The books are one. You know, the philosophy is one, non-different. You can't have two philosophies.
Yeah.
So it's obeyed. But the expression of ISKCON in different temples is obeyed. So they have, in this temple, they have Radha Govinda. They do it like this. In this temple, it's a little bit different over here. And this one, the Chari is prominent over there in ISKCON. So, you know, his or her sensibilities are going to, you know, play themselves out and so forth. So that's the difference of the beauty. But if you go now, look at ISKCON. You know, Prabhupada wanted a singular BBT. In other words, he wanted books all coming out of the BBT that would be properly edited and properly designed and so forth. And there should be some control there. Mm-hmm. And then the inspiration that comes from reading the books and so forth can show itself in different beautiful expressions. Right. So he But now you have such a control that people in the temple got to call up somebody, from somebody else who's in Timbuktu, but they're GBC, and say, such and such sadhu from this sampradaya is in town, we don't know if we can invite him here or not,
Yeah.
And some of the members in the community, know him. And, I mean, you got to be able to think more for yourself. There should be, in other words, less control.
Yes.
And there should be freedom of expression. The control should come in terms of what's the philosophy. So all of the books probably would have wanted so many books published, but all coming through the BBT. What to speak of from authors within ISKCON? What about authors outside of ISKCON? The BBT should be such that it is the Gaudiya Vaishnava publishing group, that if you get published by them, it's like getting published by Harper's,
Right.
or,
Right.
And so we find such and such Swamini has written her book, and it's Krishna Conscious. ISKCON, BBT wants to publish it and let it be known and recognize it. That to me would be very different, but than it is now in ISKCON. But it's a way that ISKCON could be, not be insular, could interact with everybody, and not at risk of I think changing the mood. Like Prabhupada's mood is in ISKCON. Prabhupada did things in certain ways, and so they want to do those things, and that's nice, and others do it differently. So you don't have to go and change. They have to do it your way. You have to do it their way. But we'll connect on the philosophy. We'll publish your book. We say you're bona fide. Everybody would love ISKCON then. And then you can also say, well, what the specialty of ISKCON is that Prabhupada is his internal life. He represents a wave of Sakyarasa coming into the world, the likes of which we haven't seen since Nityananda Prabhu himself. Right. Not that it wasn't there afterwards, and that it wasn't prominent. It was from his wave, but then that wave receded to the to the tsunami of Madhurya Rasa, based on the commentaries of the Goswamis, which came to be the orthodox teaching of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which includes Sakyarasa and so forth. But the prominence of that, with passing, for example, Nityananda and Janava coming into prominence, and her penchant for Madhurya Rasa. So historically, these things are going to happen. And even there, I know Bob was outside of ISKCON when Prabhupada was here. They told their disciples, Nityananda Prabhu has empowered this Bhaktivedanta Swami, this is where this is all coming from, Sakyarasa. So that's a unique thing. It's very beautiful. And you can get that in ISKCON. That would be a way of saying we're the best, from our subjective point of view. That it would be very charming, rather than in a way that becomes, less undesirable.
Right. I want to understand kind of a little bit of your experience in regards to being part of ISKCON as a large society, and then moving to your own society, like a small intimate society. What are your reflections around that kind of change? Like what differences, what pros, what cons did you see?
Well, I think the cons, the con would be it's nice to be part of a group of a large group of diverse persons, all practicing Krishna consciousness, where everything's all set up.
Right.
It's got an economy, it's got properties, it's got a publishing arm, it's got a social life, it's got even employment for people.
Right.
Those are things that all were set up in Prabhupada's time, and they have been continued by ISKCON. So for me, someone like me to stand out on the street in my pajamas, so to speak, as people would look at it, oh, who's that? What's that? I have no group behind me, nothing,
Yeah.
Like Prabhupada came to New York, there he was alone, and so, and then to create an economy, to create, to have properties, have a publishing arm. And I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. And to be able to have all of that and then, teach or preach, it seems to be my calling. Wow, I mean, all that facility is helpful, and the association, the opportunity to share insights with those who are, your contemporaries and so forth.
Yeah.
That's a con, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But the pros are considerable as well. And among them, given the insular nature of ISKCON, as I see it, as I experienced it, to be out of that is very refreshing, if you will, and it brings you into a larger world that ISKCON doesn't realize it's part of sometimes.
Right.
So ISKCON may be the largest institution of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, but there's a lot of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. If you put it all together everywhere, it probably has more members than ISKCON. And so you have the opportunity to be in touch with that. For me, it started with Sridhar Maharaj and other disciples of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and it goes on from there. That possibility, that's pretty much not a possibility for ISKCON. It's kind of a frowned upon, to put it mildly. And there's much to be gained from that. That type of exposure to how Gaudiya Vaishnavism is done differently over here, how historically for hundreds of years it was done like this over there, and so forth. Very interesting.
Yeah.
And very useful, very helpful in terms of sorting out what are details that can be altered and need to be altered, and what are principles that need to be maintained and embraced. And another way in which this plays out is that you get more exposure to the world. ISKCON can be very insular, such that you don't get as much exposure, perhaps, to the world. That may be a little different for some persons who are members of ISKCON but don't live at a temple. We used to all live at temples, when
Right.
I was in households and everything as well. But and it was still like that when I left ISKCON. I mean, you have to realize this was like 1982,
Yeah.
I think. That's a long time ago. Some of you weren't listening, but weren't even born then.
Yeah.
ISKCON was very, very different then. It was very, very. The walls were high and the doors were very tight. They locked, and there weren't any windows. I mean, I didn't. You could live in ISKCON, not know who the president of the United States was.
Right.
At times, so there was no internet. So it's different now. I realize that, but when I left, that was part of my experience. That I had to find a place to be a sannyasin where it was, acceptable, so to speak. So I reverted back to my previous background in alternative culture in America, which was now had morphed from hippies to all varieties of Eastern spirituality, and the term New Age was coming about then, and so forth.
Right.
And so I kind of plugged into that, learned a new vocabulary, and became an author, in alternative culture, and an author for devotees as well. If anyone would dare, to read one of my books, they're very much written for devotees to help take them deeper within. The deeper in you go, I think the more equipped you become to reach out and understand the world, and put it and there's a lot going on. And now there is more exposure to the world. I'm kind of getting off on the tangent here, but
Yeah.
that may be one of your other questions, but just hold off on that here and go back to the cons. Yeah, and there was, at that time when I left ISKCON, the BBT would not sell me Prabhupada's books to sell to other people. That's how bad I was. So I had to start writing books. That's why I started. I started writing a magazine and then books and so forth. And when you do that, you have to listen to other authors. You have to understand what contemporary thought is, what's contemporary philosophy today, and so forth. And so it was a great opportunity to grow for me. I had to think for myself. I had to, and there's some intimacy also that's probably lost to some extent in ISKCON game. So there are pros, there are cons.
Right. I think a point that I'd like to make is, like you were making that point as well. In that time when you left, everyone was living in the temples. So to leave ISKCON was an actual like, okay, I'm leaving and I'm not going to come back to living in the temple. I'm going to be doing my own thing. And so, but in now 2021, for someone to, when I heard someone say it like a few months ago, I'm going to leave ISKCON. Like I was thinking, what does that actually mean? Like you don't live in the temple. You don't. I mean, we've been COVID quarantined for a year and a half now. Like, what does that mean to leave ISKCON now? Now, I don't think it really even means anything because it's not applicable anymore. Anyway, that's just a little thought on that.
Yeah, it's very different now.
The
world is very porous comparatively. So. Yeah, I mean, that time it was like the earth is flat. You walk outside of ISKCON, it's just like Columbus sailed the ocean and it's flat and he's going to fall off. That's what they thought. We proved they were wrong. We proved the world was round. Right? So, good.
Yeah. I'd like to shift gears a little bit, Maharaj, in regards to the actual title of this podcast. And I love talking about, the history and things, but let's talk a little bit about becoming a progressive Vaishnava in this modern world. There's some questions I want to address because we're at 1 hour and 37. There's some questions regarding our actual original topic, and I just want to pose those to you. So how do we remain true to ancient teachings while practicing in a modern world, especially one where the social demands of the modern world are such that a Krishna conscious response to them is not necessarily self-evident?
Well, I think that first of all, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur told his disciples when they were asked in the public by other Vaishnavas, what paribar, what Gaudiya paribar are you members of? Paribar means like what lineage, what family you're members of.
Right.
He taught them to reply, Bhakti Vinod Paribar.
Wow.
Prabhupada said that my movement is the movement of Bhakti Vinod. Bhakti Vinod is the grandfather or great-grandfather of all of us, ISKCON members, Gaudiya Math, and me, and people like me, and so forth. And Bhakti Vinod Thakur did something that had never been done before in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which was to begin to interface with the modern world. And he took certain liberties with the philosophy to do so, and he very much emphasized what in his terms, Saragrahi Vaishnava, how to be the idea of being an essential Vaishnav, and really differentiating between details and principles. The objections to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur that are there in the past all amount to, on the part of those objectors, conflating principles with details. So let's go to social issues. Okay, so those are details, really, and not only that, but the question was when a response to social issues, how to may not be apparent within Krishna consciousness rhetoric, or to say it differently, perhaps, it sounds like we should respond in a way that would really be out of sync with the way the world going in this regard, right?
Right.
Let's take an issue. Let's take homosexuality,
Right.
as an example. Okay, so Prabhupada said a couple of things about homosexuality that indicate that that it's bad.
Right. Right.
Once Sridhar Maharaj was told about lesbians. He never heard of them before,
Oh,
and he couldn't
interesting.
figure out how that would work. I hate to be crude,
Right.
but he couldn't figure out how that would work sexually.
Right.
So what I'm speaking about here is a kind of naivety on his part, because lacking information about a subject.
Yeah.
It's not that Prabhupada had all the information needed about every subject to weigh in and give a comprehensive answer. He often sought information from his disciples in the West so that he could give informed kind of explanations or responses. Unfortunately, many of us were not competent to give informed opinions, or we just tried to say what we thought he wanted us to say,
Yeah.
which was in his own words, his shortcoming. He didn't have anyone to consult with, he wrote to Sridhar Maharaj. We were limited in our ability to do so. We were very young and so forth. What we told him about science and what we knew about it was where he got most of his information, So,
Right.
so he would respond in certain ways. So the homosexuality, here's a social issue. So Prabhupada said things which, if you just take them on their face, there's a couple of statements, maybe something written in the book, and a couple other things in the letter or conversation that you now decide that. Are you there?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm there.
Yeah. That the only Krishna conscious response to this social issue is what would be called, socially speaking, probably amongst the majority, a homophobic response.
Right.
Or a response that's not moving in the direction of social norms that the society is moving. And I realize there are plenty of people who are conservative at perspective and homophobic and think that that's the way things should go. But the majority of the world, I don't think thinks like that. In this country, in the United States, I don't think that's the case.
Right. Correct. Yeah.
So what are you going to do? I mean, how do you? It's kind of the question. How do I respond? Because it seems like I should just say it's bad because Prabhupada said it's bad. But that's not what Prabhupada taught. Just because he said something about something, we should repeat it exactly. So he said we should use our intelligence. This is the hallmark of preaching, as I said earlier. To separate details from principles. There's relativity in preaching because according to the time and circumstance, you're going to preach in a certain way. Time and circumstance changes,
Sure.
So you have to change with it. The world changes, people change. People's brains are different now than they were 100 years ago. Let's speak of 200 years ago. There are different species. I mean, they're an evolved, whatever species of humans. They're developing in that sense, evolved, and or devolved, however you want to think about it. But the world is never the same. It's always going to show itself differently at different times and different places. So there needs to be commentary on it in those times. So, what are you going to do? I mean, 11 guys play football and they're only interested in playing football and girls are silly. And then one day, 10 guys on the team miss the play because they're all attracted to the cheerleaders.
Right.
And the 11th guy is attracted to the quarterback.
Right.
So what are you supposed to do with that? I mean, you're supposed to say, well, the book says this. Prabhupada at that time said, 10 sentences on it over there. Meanwhile, what's really happening here? This person reaches puberty and that's how he feels.
Yeah.
So okay. Prabhupada said, well, how can they do this? Even animals don't do this. Well, the fact of the matter is there is homosexuality in animals. So are we supposed to just say that's not true because Prabhupada said it? No. You have to see that based on information that Prabhupada had, familiarity with a certain phenomenon, he would comment on it at times. But I saw that Prabhupada, if he got new information, would change his mind on things also. I had personal experience of that. So are we going to think that Prabhupada was irrational?
Right.
That based on new information? I mean, I grew up thinking homosexuality was weird as a kid. I mean, in those days, the yogurt was weird, So, what to speak of yoga, So, I mean,
Yeah.
I was attracted to both, and I was weird, but I also thought homosexuality was weird. But when I looked into the issue, I realized, well, this is what's going on here, So, again, Prabhupada wanted to use your intelligence. This is the detail, and so you. That doesn't mean, you use the word progressive. Progressive is a loaded word. I mean, it's a political
Right.
a term also that applies to a certain group of people. I don't agree with everything that progressives say or their political perspective, but some of the things I do, obviously, and I think that Prabhupada or any guru would expect their disciples to use their intelligence and land on their feet and apply themselves in a new world in Krishna consciousness. It's a new world. It's a different world. And it's changing at such a rate now that, 10 years now with technological developments, the changes that they bring are greater than in centuries past, the amount of change you would find in 100 years.
Yeah.
So it's hard to keep up with. Now, on the other side, you don't have to keep up with it all either, You could, like from a scientific point of view, let's say, cosmological point of view, you could live in a Puranic world and do bhajan and fine.
Right.
If you're going to live in the world and you're going to have to be confronted with modern philosophy and scientific findings and so on and so forth, well, be acquainted with it to the extent that you're interested in it or you have to, or it comes up in terms of your conversations and so forth. And then weigh in from a Krishna conscious point of view on it. Let's take, Bhagavad cosmography you find in the fifth canto. Well, Parikshit Maharaj asks Sukadev to tell him about the nature of the Maya Shakti, because it's one of the Shaktis of Bhagawan, and by knowing about it, he'll know more about Bhagawan. It's a basic idea.
Right.
And Sukadev replies at the onset, he says, well, I'll tell you what I can, based on what the Puranic, historical, record is in different Puranas, but essentially, it's basically a transformation of the modes of nature. That's what it is. It's basically a transformation of the modes. It's always in flux and so forth. But this is the way they looked at it in the Puranas. So the Bhagavad takes from other Puranas and passes on that particular perspective. It's also spoken about in that way in the Bhagavatam for certain members of the audience along the bank of the Ganges who didn't have complete adhikar for bhakti. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur makes this point. It's a way of looking at the world from a mystic yoga perspective rather than from a bhakti perspective even. So what did Bhaktivinoda Thakur say? Well, the hellish planets, they say things like this to scare people. That fear is also sometimes used as a motive to implore people to take up a religious life in the Puranic text, Bhagavatam included. I'm not saying there's not a hell, but I'm saying Bhaktivinoda Thakur said that. So look at our grandfather, our great grandfather, that the source, so to speak, of our own Paribar, the seventh Goswami, and how did he look at history?
Yeah.
Even philosophy, for that matter. These are relative things. What can you say philosophically? You cannot, in word or in thought, fully, comprehensively capture the nature of ultimate reality. I mean, you can't do that. It's beyond thought. It's
Right.
beyond word.
Right.
Now we can go there to some extent and then try to put it in word, try to put it in thought, and that may be helpful and so forth. But it will be, will have its limitations. So
Yeah. Piggybacking on that same question, the next question is, how do you adapt Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy into your life in the modern day, especially in terms of understanding how to discern the principle and the details?
How do you go about discerning the principles over the details?
Correct, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, it takes intelligence. It takes spiritual intelligence. And I think that one would be ill-equipped to do so, to the extent that they're not well studied in the literature and well grounded in very core principles of Gaudiya Vedanta.
Mm-hmm.
For example, here's a core principle: I'm not the body, right?
Right.
So what does that mean in terms of the mind-body philosophical argument? What is consciousness? What is mind? What is body? Is the mind the brain? This is a big philosophical debate. It's hardly a debate anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's thought to be already won, although it hasn't by far. And the winners have proclaimed that the mind is the brain. So what to speak of there being God? There's no Atma. There's no self. There's no subjective experiences that are fundamentally real. That they're illusion. Colors don't really exist. That's just a subjective illusion. It's physicalism, naturalism. This is the prominent, perspective philosophically in the world today. It's the antithesis of our idea that the difference between the Atma, that there's a self, to speak of God and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to take the argument that you're not the body and to understand it in light of modern philosophy would be very, very grounding for devotees. Let's take Leela. So here's the thing. Krishna's lifting the Govardhan hill. He's doing all these miracles, right?
Yeah.
He's doing all these fantastic things but I never even thought about or questioned for a minute, when we were first learning about it from Prabhupada. But I mean, it's understandable. People go, what?
Yeah.
Or isn't this just religious baggage? Isn't this just myth and so on and so forth? Well, I think it's fair to say that the Leela narratives are not literally true. In other words, what I mean by that is that they're more than what you can say about them in words. I don't mean they're not literally true, and therefore they're just a metaphor, and ultimately there's no Leela. No, if you're grounded in the Chitta Beta Beta, there has to be Leela. There has to be movement and transcendence.
Right.
That's Beta Beta. The absolute is one, and within the absolute, there's movement at the same time. The interaction between the Shakti and the Shaktiman. This is Leela. There's play. There's love. I mean, is it better to, philosophically speaking, in terms of Vedanta, is it better to love to exist? That's Gyan Marg. I love to exist.
Right.
Or is it better to exist to love? That's Bhakti Marg.
Yeah.
You love to exist means Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. I'm living. I'm peaceful. I've transcended the differences, the dualities of material existence, and I'm just resting. But Bhakti activates one in transcendence, right? So there's movement in transcendence, beauty, charm, and so on and so forth. And so there must be Leela. Now, the representation of the Leela we have primarily from our founding acharyas who've written Leela Granthas, comments on the Bhagavatam Leelas, and so on and so forth. And they're trying to do justice to what the Leela is by way of speaking about Krishna Leela from the perspective of Madhurya or Sakya. And then impressions are coming on devotees. Samskars, bhakti samskars, whether they know it or not. For these, this is what the Bhagavatam is doing, what distinguishes it from all other Puranas. It's speaking about Krishna Leela in such a way as to generate impressions for these sentiments, which gives us access to eventually through subsequent practice to enter into them. So the Leelas are not literal in that sense. They're someone's gone there, experienced that in samadhi, come back to talk about it, try to put it in words, and they've used poetry as a genre of language to speak about it. Because in poetry, the moon can have wings and can fly across the sky.
Right.
Poetry expands. It speaks to what we feel as souls in this world. We feel that there's more to life than what meets the eye and the mind. We don't realize it's us that's the more.
Right.
We're more than the mind. We're more than the eye or the body. It's us, and we're coming out, so to speak, in human life. And we all live for those moments in which we exceed the possibility, what was thought to be the limits of possibilities, whether it be in sports or like if you run 1/10,000th of a second faster than somebody else, you get a gold medal and it's celebrated and so forth.
Yeah.
We're living for these, as humans, for these moments which we transcend the previously was thought to be impossible. So we're living for a world in which nothing is impossible. That's the world of consciousness.
Right.
And Krishna consciousness in particular. And that, in that world, what possibilities lie? And to try to talk about them, well, our acharyas have done so, and those talks are powerful. Those narratives about Krishna Leela, they're very powerful. At the same time, the Leela is way more than you could imagine. It is simply by reading it and memorizing, Krishna did this here, Krishna did that, which isn't a bad thing, but
Right.
it's more than that. So I think that, that's hard for some devotees, perhaps, but if you're grounded, really grounded in the idea that you're not the body, and you've thought it out philosophically as well, and interface that idea with modern claims that you're not, modern interpretations of scientific evidence, philosophized about, and so forth, which is called materialism. It's a philosophy or physical. If you've thought that out, you're standing on firm ground, and that ground is such that it's the ground, if you will, of the land where, to use Prabhupada's quoting of Napoleon, in that land, impossible is not found in the lexicon. It's not found in the dictionary.
Right.
I mean, how much the world changes if you are an Atma, actually. So the Leela is there's no stretch to have a land of such a dimension of such possibilities of interaction with the absolute. So anyway, I'm just going off a bit here, but what I'm saying in one sense is the more you go into Krishna consciousness with good association, the more you find there's things in these books you never even realized that are so pertinent, applicable, so essential, and they're exciting to read. I don't know how excited many devotees are to read the books. And I read a Prabhupada's book and they refer to another book. I go to that book. I find that book. I find different translations of the book and so forth.
Right.
I wrote a number of books. One of the books I wrote was a commentary on Shikshastakam. One of the reasons, because I did some research and found that over the centuries, there's only a couple of commentaries on Shikshastakam. I thought, well, maybe we'll write one here. So I wrote one,
Wow.
I was excited to write it and read it myself. But how many devotees were interested? Of course, a lot of them think I'm the deviant, so they shouldn't read us. But I mean, geez, a commentary on Shikshastakam, or I was one of the first, maybe the first devotee, disciple of Prabhupada, to write a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. People said, who do you think he is to write a Bhagavad Gita commentary?
Right.
I am who I am, whatever. I mean, I'm not great or anything like that, but yeah, I did that. And when Prabhupada was first told, this Tripurari Das, he's distributed so many books on this day. I think in a letter from Rameswar, Prabhupada wrote back, said, very nice that this boy is distributing so many books, but you should see that he's always reading them. He wrote that in his own handwriting.
Wow.
As like a footnote, to the typed letter. So I've lived in the books. Anybody want to compare notes about what
Yeah.
what the Prabhupada's books, I could, would like to do that. And as I say, I used to read them, read a translation, read the purport. The purport would quote a verse somewhere else from the Gita. Then I'd go to that, and I'd read that purport. That would quote a verse in another book. Then I'd go there until that thread was exhausted. Then I'd go back to where I started and go forward. That's the way I would read. And so it also includes going to other books, which are more available and so forth. And you can, with good association, you can really get really grounded happily in Krishna consciousness as a sadhaka and be comfortable living in the modern world and be able to determine what's essential and what's not. And it's what Krishna consciousness is about. It's not, here it is, just turn to page 108, there's your answer. You have to think. There's a lot of gray.
Right.
And love is gray. She loves me not. Krishna doesn't know if Radha loves him or not,
Right.
Sometimes. He has to have Subal, say, yes, she loves you, it's okay.
Right.
And chant Radha Nam in his ear.
Sorry.
So, you have to think, and you have to think, I need good association, and I need to find in the books what I can't find myself through that association. And I can be a very, and I could, and I should then. Bhakti Vinod, to refer back to, he was a member of the world. He would have been a talking head if they had television in those days, right?
Yeah.
And what does Bhakti Vinod say about that? Yeah. So if you want to be like that, and you should, you do have to be more grounded. You have to go within to be able to reach out and understand the world around you and how to look at it.
Right. Maharaj, we've reached our 2-hour mark.
Okay.
And
I'm sorry.
No. I want more parts. 2, 3, 4, 5. And I want to see you as well as all our listeners. But I just want to ask you for some parting words, some maybe a concluding statement from you.
Well, I don't know what to say.
Sorry to put you on the spot there.
I think that we should be very generous with one another.
Yes.
And everyone else.
Yes.
That we are affected positively by the dispensation of the Mahavadanya avatar, as Rupa Goswami characterized him, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu.
Yes.
And he is Krishna himself, who Uddhava, who is Shastravid, who knows all the Shastra, he's Krishna's advisor in Dwarka, said, who in their right mind would take shelter of anyone other than Krishna? When Uddhava when Putana just dressed as a devotee with an evil intention, and he blessed her with the form of Vatsalya Rasa. So who in their right mind would take shelter of anyone else but Krishna? Krishna is the most generous, and in his form of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he's even more generous. So, we're only here because of grace. That's all. I said, I had no education. It's all grace, and we should be very graceful and generous with one another.
Yeah.
And there's too much arguing and too much just verse quoting, without understanding the meaning and so forth. So
yes,
I hope that resonates with your listeners.
Definitely.
And if they'll be generous with me, please be
sure. Yeah.
Some kind.
Yes. I mean, I can't thank you enough, Maharaj, for joining and kind of putting yourself out there to tell your story and for us to hear it. I think you said it the best. We should all be very generous with each other. We're Vaishnavas, and we should all see each other as Vaishnavas beyond, okay, some maybe rubber stamp of ISKCON or not. And I want to do a second, third part with you because you have so much to share in regards to we just even scratched the surface on the progressive Vaishnava topic that we were talking about. But even beyond that, any other social issues that are in our society that we can talk about from a Vaishnava point of view. I think you have a really amazing way of articulating and communicating those things to a devotee audience. So I thank you so much, and I thank all our listeners for listening. We will have Maharaj on again for sure in the near future. We'll get all the internet and all that stuff set beforehand, so we'll be able to see Maharaj. If you want to get in touch with Maharaj, he's on Facebook. He has a website. I'm sure some of his disciples will put it up on the comment section. Another disclaimer: I love all Vaishnavas. I love ISKCON. I love everyone. So let's all be kind and generous to each other, as well as on the comment section. Next week we are having Prahladananda Swami, the ISKCON health minister, coming on to talk about, as well as with a few other devotees, to talk about the current world situation from his point of view. So that should be interesting. Again, thank you, Maharaj, for joining. And thank you, everyone else, for joining. We will see you next time. Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Krishna Hare